Hi. Thank you both for being here. I'm excited to be here with Simon and Michael, two strong advocates for nuclear who I think might come at some of these issues that we're going to talk about from different angles at certain points. We thought we'd start to close out the afternoon with a topic that doesn't inflame passions very much, nuclear energy. Nuclear provides about 2/3 of America's carbon-free power, but it is the most controversial solution to global warming. Let me just, before I start with the two of you, I just want to say again, I think I'm going to keep with our previous format of integrating questions from the audience into our discussions. So I'll keep one eye on the audience. If you've got questions, please indicate. I'll have a microphone come around, and we'll do that in between my questions. But Michael, you have spoken many times about the need for people to get over their fear of nuclear. Make the case.
Well, I think the first thing that's important to understand is that I was anti-nuclear like almost all of my life. I was raised in a long-standing Christian pacifist family. We recognized the trauma of nuclear weapons. I've always been an advocate of diplomacy first. I was a major renewable energy advocate. I pushed very hard for a big investment in renewables that President Obama largely did. We did about $150 billion in renewables over the last decade or so, in renewables and efficiency and EVs. I only changed my mind after I really had to confront the limitations of solar and wind alone. And the limitations are twofold. The first is just the intermittency, which people are familiar with. We don't have that large-scale storage. I mean, even Governor Jerry Brown last night said that. We don't have that large-scale storage. So that means that when the sun's not shining, the wind's not blowing, the natural gas plants or the coal plants or the other fossil fuel plants are burning a lot and putting out a lot of emissions. And then the other is the energy density. So to give you a sense of it, it requires about 100 times more land in terms of to create the same amount of electricity from a solar farm as it does from a nuclear plant. So people think, well, California's got a lot of empty deserts, but it turns out that those have really big impacts on the natural environment. So I only changed my mind after several years of conversations with people like Stuart Brand, Pulitzer Prize winner Richard Rhodes, and my friend, the climate scientist James Hansen, who were just like, look, you really want to bet the planet on intermittent and energy dilute renewables. Let's keep doing solar and wind, but you can't ignore the fact that nuclear is our largest source of low carbon power. It produces 4 times fewer emissions than solar, and it's cheap and reliable. And so, I think to give you one sense of it, before I came, you can see here, I don't know which way the camera is, California electricity prices have actually risen 3.5 times more than electricity prices in the United States as a whole. And so people say, well, renewables are coming down in price, but actually, as they become a larger part of electricity, the electricity gets more expensive. It was started out when Governor Brown took office in 2011, 13 cents a kilowatt hour. Now it's 18 cents a kilowatt hour. Our 2 nuclear plants, one of which is shuttered, produce power for about 4.5 cents a kilowatt hour. So
let's come back to California.
Take that in mind.
I want to put a pin in that for a moment because, so Simon, earlier this month, the International Atomic Energy Agency said that that nuclear is just not enough, attracting enough investment to limit climate change. How can nuclear be a solution to climate change if it's not attracting the investment to make that?
Yes, in terms of nuclear's relationship with capital, you could say that in sort of open capital markets in the West, that the nuclear industry does have a problem with its relationship with private capital. But that's not true in many Asian economies, where that capital is provided largely at a sovereign level. And in those economies, there's a significant sovereign commitment to nuclear new build with conventional reactor systems. So the plans in those fast-growing economies, China, India, in those economies that there is a substantial commitment to nuclear because they understand that if they are to wean themselves off coal, and coal is by far the largest dominant component of their energy basket, they need something with as much energy muscle as coal. And the only thing that has as much energy muscle as coal is nuclear. So if you look in those markets, and you look at sovereign plans for nuclear new build with conventional systems in those markets, they're really very impressive, actually, in terms of capital commitment.
And that's where most of
That's
the
where
growth
the growth
is
is,
now
yes,
in
absolutely.
China and India?
Yeah.
Turning back to the US, though, I mean, and even in China and in India, I mean, do falling solar and wind prices make nuclear unnecessary?
Well, they actually, electricity is a service. It's not a commodity. So it's like saying corn and wheat are cheaper, therefore restaurant prices have come down. There's so much more that goes into delivering a meal at the restaurant than the ingredients. And so, like I said, when you look at Germany, you've seen electricity prices increase 50% over the last 10 years. And yet it still has only half of the clean power that France produces because it's been shutting down its nuclear plants. So, I think that you've seen, Illinois, New York. 2 years ago, I started Environmental Progress. Before that, I had a think tank. And we've been working with James Hansen and the other people I mentioned to save nuclear plants in the United States. California is our next stop. But Illinois, New York, we've now seen France has actually decided to stick with nuclear. South Korea is sticking with nuclear. So things have changed very rapidly, in part because I think people realize solar and wind are actually making electricity more expensive in many places, including California. We got to keep our base load clean energy from nuclear. Got to stop shutting those plants down.
And the politics of nuclear in Washington, actually set the stage where Secretary Perry came out with a plan to subsidize coal and nuclear.
Right.
It's facing a lot of challenges. Where does that stand now?
I mean, the interesting thing is that support for nuclear has actually increased quite a bit within Washington, D.C. So you've seen people like strong climate hawks, Sheldon Whitehouse, for example. Cory Booker gave a very moving defense of nuclear last year, in part referencing the high levels of asthma among African-American kids from New Jersey. So I think you've seen a real bipartisan consensus. You saw Hillary Clinton come out in defending nuclear plants when she ran for office last year. Republicans have always supported nuclear. It's kind of like they just support nuclear because it's like they're Republicans and Republicans like nuclear. So, I usually talk to Democrats about it because Democrats are the ones that have to make that move. You can't be taken seriously on climate change and be anti-nuclear anymore. And I think you've seen that shift. And so you've seen it so that
Who have you seen the shift with? I mean, who support nuclear in Congress?
Well, the big changes, of course, was the big wins last year was New York and Illinois. So you saw all of the big anti-nuclear groups. We basically kind of forced them to go along with deals to keep those nuclear plants running. You see a big bipartisan group behind the kind of new nuclear technologies that Simon's company is advocating. And we've also found a big bipartisan consensus for these advanced fuels. Most people don't know about it. It's a total sleeper issue. But there are now fuels that they're developing that will resist meltdown for several hours and potentially several days. It could be game-changing. Right now, they're being loaded into nuclear plants next year. So I think that the ingredients are there, and I think you've seen on climate, we did one time I was in an audience like this, and they dial tested the audience, and they asked them if they thought we needed a nuclear for climate before I spoke, and then after. The difference between before and after was 30%. People literally, when they were exposed to the basic truth about nuclear, changed their minds.
Michael Shellenberger. I'm looking to the audience if there's questions in the aisle, woman on the aisle on my left.
What should the United States do with its nuclear waste?
So the first thing to know about nuclear waste is that it's the only waste from any way of making electricity that's completely contained and protected. So waste from fossil fuels goes into the environment and it kills 7 million people a year, according to the World Health Organization. People say to me, what about nuclear waste? I say, well, what about the solar waste? And one of the reactions I always get on Twitter is people go, there's no solar waste. In fact, solar panels go somewhere. That's the first lesson from ecology. And they contain heavy toxic metals. They contain lead, cadmium, and chromium. And outside of the EU, there's no policy to safely dispose of solar panels. So if you just count the amount of solar it takes to produce the same amount of electricity as nuclear, they actually end up creating 200 to 300 times more toxic waste. And it just joins the electronic waste stream. If you've seen the story of Stuff, you know what I'm talking about. It just joins the electronic waste stream. Often goes to poor countries where kids in Africa or India have to disassemble it and end up exposed to very heavy toxins. So I think that what you get with, I think the problem has been solved. I don't know why you would need to move it anywhere. We've got it in these containers. It never harms anybody. when I was a anti-nuclear advocate, because I watched The Simpsons, which is where I got my information, I used to think that nuclear waste was green and liquid. It's just the used rods, the used fuel rods, and they're incredibly well protected. So I think they're one of the great success stories. It was used as a strategy, including by myself, to generate fear of nuclear. And so when you attack nuclear waste, the strategy was, they would say, to clog up the toilet just to make nuclear energy more difficult. But I think we actually already have a very elegant solution to it.
Simon?
Well, in terms of what the United States is doing with nuclear waste, I mean, that was established in the early 80s under the Waste Disposal Act. So it's very clear in US legislation that if nuclear power utilities operate nuclear power plants, nuclear facilities that are appropriately licensed with the NRC, the federal government will take responsibility of disposing of that waste. And that bargain, the other side of that bargain is that the utilities will agree to contribute on a regular basis a small amount, a very, very small amount, into a sinking fund that accumulates over many decades. And that sinking fund will be used to fund, without expense to the taxpayer, that sinking fund will be used to develop a deep geological repository for nuclear waste. Now, the problem about that strategy is that it's now the responsibility of the federal government to select a site. That project has been a political football for 40 years. So it's a social political problem with respect to where we select the site, but it's absolutely not a technology problem. It's been wrapped up in energy politics, and it's been a political football for 40 years. So I would say there is no waste problem from an industrial or a technology perspective, but there is a political problem associated with where that site is selected. I'll just add one more point on waste disposal. Waste disposal from a private sector perspective, there are a number of other nations who have commissioned reports to look at the nuclear waste cycle. The South Australian government initiated a royal commission to look into this. During that very thorough review process, some economic analysis was conducted, where it was proposed that the industrial task of disposing of nuclear waste is a very, very profitable exercise. Above ground today, there are about 400,000 tons of heavy metal waste, and the disposal fee for each ton is in the order of $1 to $2 million. Now, the safe disposal of nuclear waste, not being a technology issue, but being a political issue, there is this realization now, not just in South Australia, that perhaps the amount of wealth associated with getting on with the job and selecting a site will sort of unlock this political problem, because at the moment it is simply a political problem.
The question in the front here on the left.
Yes.
Wait, let's wait for a microphone over here in the front row.
So from your perspectives...
You can tell us your name and...
Yeah, okay, I'm David Gelber from Years of Living Dangerously. From your perspectives, why aren't more nuclear plants being built? Are the obstacles political, from your perspective, political know-nothings? Or are there real economic obstacles? Why aren't we seeing more nuclear plants if it makes sense?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you got to understand that. I mean, first of all, look, Greenpeace alone, which is a fierce anti-nuclear campaign organization, has $400 million a year that it spends, including in Korea. They were spending huge amounts of money. Ultimately, they were defeated. We helped the Koreans, and they made the case to the people, and they decided to keep going with their nuclear program. NRDC, EDF, Sierra Club, these are all anti-nuclear organizations, and they each have budgets on the order of $70 to $120 million a year. So clearly, it's fear-mongering. I mean, the record is very clear now. We have 45 years of data. The most recent study was in Lancet, the British medical journal. Nuclear is the safest way to produce reliable power. And the implication of that's very important. James Hansen, the climate scientist, a couple of years ago came out with a study showing that nuclear power has saved 1.8 million lives by preventing harmful smoke from going into the atmosphere. So the truth is, these things are just not known. The nuclear industry is basically just utilities that own all sorts of plants, coal, natural gas. renewables. They don't have any allegiance to nuclear. So it really took a group of us that were independent to make this case, and it's already, we're seeing, big differences. So I mentioned those two different U.S. states, and we've seen a bunch of countries now recommit to nuclear once the truth gets out.
Yes, I would answer your question with respect to that point I made about 10 minutes ago, and that is the relationship with private capital markets. In the West, most infrastructure projects are financed not from a sovereign balance sheet, but from private balance sheets. Now, the problem about that is a conventional nuclear new build power plant is a project that is too big, has marginal economics, and has risk components that are not easily digestible by private sector participants. Namely, for the private sector, it's a scary industrial project, not simply because the economics are marginal, but it's so big. And if something goes wrong, it'll take your business down. And this is the problem with Westinghouse and Toshiba. So this, to some extent, opens the door for nuclear innovation, because we must be very, very careful we don't conflate two issues. One is the virtues of nuclear energy as a vastly scalable energy source that really must be part of our portfolio for a clean, prosperous future with a technology choice. Now, the technology choice that people, when they discuss nuclear, they're actually discussing a technology choice that was made 60 years ago. It's called the pressurized water reactor, and it was our first technology choice at the start of the nuclear age. The reality is, from a technology perspective, that we can do so much better than a technology that was developed for first commercial deployment 60 years ago. Now, so the question for nuclear is not really, whether it's going to be deployed or not. The question is what nuclear technology we're going to select to go forward. Now, that is the really, really exciting question, because that can be answered with new nuclear technologies that have very, very different commercial profiles, much smaller, much more cost competitive, much easier to build in Western economies. And they have very different social profiles too. Nuclear power plants that have the capability to being literally walk-away safe. And the third profile as well, which also has a social component to it, is waste. Nuclear innovation and different nuclear technologies can address the back end of the fuel cycle and do it very, very effectively. So the question we should be asking ourselves today with respect to nuclear energy is what nuclear technology we're going to use, or technologies we're going to use to take nuclear energy forward over the next 50, 100 years.
And actually, since you're on, can you give us the sort of 50-cent tour of molten salt reactor design? Well,
a molten salt reactor is a liquid fuel reactor system, and it is conventional nuclear is solid fuel. Molten salt reactors use a liquid fuel. So this is a very, very different technology at the most fundamental level. The great virtue of the liquid fuel reactor system is that you have at the heart, and I don't necessarily want to get too technical with 7 minutes to go, but the heart of this system, is when you're fissioning in a molten salt, you have a system which is so much more effective, naturally effective, inherently effective at distributing that intense heat of the fission process. And that is the heart of your engineering challenge. And the engineering challenge is, can you dissipate the heat of the fission process in every conceivable set of circumstances? You have to make that case to your regulator. When you're using a thermally stable molten salt, your case is very, very different. And we argue that superior case gives you a very, very different commercial profile.
I saw a hand on this side, gentleman in the brown jacket. Yes, and then I'll,
what is the status of the cleanup now in Japan, and who is paying for it?
Sure, I can answer that. I've been to Fukushima twice. I was just there. A couple of things to remember about it. Nobody died or will die from radiation from Fukushima. The Japanese government over-cleaned it. The soil in my home state of Colorado is twice as radioactive as some of the most radioactive soils in Fukushima were. So the cost is just part of nuclear production. Nuclear is the cheapest way to make electricity in Japan. Now, I did want to get back to an emissions point. Can I just show one thing? Which is just, we wanted to get to California, and we got 5 minutes. California is a microcosm. You can see last night, Governor Jerry Brown got on stage and said that emissions are going down in California. I'm afraid to say he lied. And he said that there was problems with the data. I went online, I got the data. Emissions have gone up in California since Jerry Brown took office in 2011. They've gone down in the rest of the United States. This is all available from the Energy Information Administration. We've got an administration in California here that had to use secrecy and corruption. They spent $4.7 billion shutting down San Onofre. Now they're trying to shut down Diablo Canyon. So I'm happy to announce and make a little news on stage that I'll be running for governor of the state of California, and I'm officially announcing it right now. And I've got my first endorsement from climate scientist James Hansen, who is as sick of both the Democrats and the Republicans as I am.
We've made some news. And your platform is going to be bring nuclear back to California?
You know, my position is, look, if the California people, after participating in a deliberative democratic process, decide that they don't want to have nuclear power, then as governor, I will accede to that wish. But in South Korea, they had a citizens jury that weighed the issues. Support for nuclear went from 40% to 60%. They killed San Onofre on the behest of fossil fuel interests at a cost of $4.7 billion. Now they're trying to kill Diablo Canyon. They're going to increase electricity rates. It's a net transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich. It's an absolute injustice. The media has not covered it adequately outside of San Diego. I encourage people to take a hard look at it, but my agenda is going to be reform, reform, reform. We have the highest some of the highest taxes in the country, and the highest poverty rate.
Over there, on the, I have a hand on the left side, my left. Like 5 rows in, yeah.
I may have gotten it wrong, meet you here in this Leaders Foundation, but my impression was that San Onofre was closed because it was defective and at risk.
That was
and
the
that
propaganda.
The utility didn't want to spend the money to fix it.
It's
That's
a lie.
The reason why.
It's a lie. The head of the CPUC went right to the executive of Southern California Edison in Poland and dictated the terms of them closing San Onofre. It's all in the media. It's all been covered. It came out in secret emails. There's a federal and state criminal investigation that's ongoing because the CPUC, which is corrupt to its core, will not release the secret emails that almost certainly show criminal involvement from the governor or the governor's people. All of this is public record. Look it up yourself. The cost of that steam generator that they had problems with was $800 million. The cost that we are paying to close it down is $4.7 billion. It's an absolute outrage.
Let's have some more, please. Let's see. There's someone on the right side. Over there, gentleman with the standing up.
Hi, I'm Sarah Hunt. I direct the Energy Innovation Project at the American Legislative Exchange Council. And my question is for Mr. Shellenberger, especially since you're now running for office. We've talked a lot here about making the conversation more inclusive on the political side and what needs to happen for that to become possible. So I'd be very interested if you have spent time talking to conservatives or Republicans about nuclear and advanced nuclear, and if that changes the conversation about, air emissions and carbon when you have that conversation.
Absolutely.
That conversation.
Thank you for the question. And so first of all, I'm a lifelong Democrat, but I'm sickened by the corruption in my own party in this state, so I'm running as an independent. I intend to get support from everybody across the political spectrum, Democrats, Republicans, independents, socialists, centrists, everybody. Everybody has an interest in cleaning up this corrupt state. In terms of nuclear and climate, it's the most amazing thing. When you talk to Republicans about nuclear, they love nuclear for reasons that go beyond issues or rational reasons. It eases them into an appreciation of nuclear's environmental benefits. Most people never hear about nuclear's environmental benefits. And so what I find is that Republicans really soften their climate skepticism when you make the case for nuclear on environmental grounds. And I'm looking forward to building some of that bipartisan conversation in my run for office.
Simon, what do you think of Michael as an ambassador for the nuclear industry in the state of California?
I will say that Michael has been prepared to raise, I think, some very important issues for discussion over our use of nuclear power going forward. And for many, many years, for many, many decades, no one really wanted to initiate that debate. So I really applaud Michael for asking these difficult questions and stimulating, I think, what is a very, very important debate, and it has to be an honest debate, on the use of nuclear power in solving our really big, big challenges going forward. One's climate, and the other's energy poverty. Nuclear can play a very, very important role in both of them. Well done, Michael. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
Okay.